So you did learn a lot about Angular's change detection mechanism, but at its core, everything you learned here, pretty much everything, still only works the way it does because Angular uses Zone.js. Because it's that zone that wraps the Angular app, kind of, that tells Angular when an event occurs or once something changed. And that, in the end, is the source for the change detection or for most change detection cycles here. No matter if you're using a service or signals. But if you are using signals, like here in the counter component, then you can actually get rid of Zone.js because that signal feature is a feature provided by Angular. You create signals with that signal function that's provided by Angular. And therefore, when you change a signal anywhere in your code, no matter if you do it because a timer expired or because a user clicked a button, when you change a signal's value, Angular, of course, knows about it because the signal is created with a function that comes from Angular. So internally, that signal object that is created here can, of course, notify Angular if its value changed. And the same is true for event bindings, for example. Just like signals, this is an Angular feature. So of course, Angular knows when that button gets clicked because it handles the click event. It triggers these methods, which we set up with event binding. So of course, it can still also trigger change detection for this component without Zone.js because it does know about such events. And therefore, with that in mind, we can actually consider removing Zone.js. Because if we only use signals or event bindings like this, then in the end, we have good sources that will tell Angular that something changed and that will allow Angular to run change detection. It's just timers, like the one we had in the counter variable, which no longer will be considered because it's timers like these that were previously handled by Zone.js. Zone.js listened to expiring timers and told Angular that something changed and that Angular should consider running change detection. But if we use signals and we update signals inside of timers, then we have a way of telling Angular that something changed, even without Zone.js. And that's why, therefore, when using signals, we can get rid of Zone.js. And it turns out that Angular nowadays, when using at least version 18, allows you to do that. And since Angular sets up subscriptions in the places where you read a signal in your templates, since Angular does that, it of course also knows which parts should be checked for changes and which parts of the application should update as a signal value changes. And therefore, you can actually get rid of Zone.js. And that, in the end, of course, will lead to more fine-grained change detection. It leads to a smaller bundle size, to a smaller code bundle that's being produced because the Zone.js code isn't part of that bundle anymore. And it leads to less behind-the-scenes checks, less listeners for events behind the scenes. So lots of good things. And therefore here in this application, I'll switch back to using signals by going to the messages service. And here I'll remove that subject and set messages back to being a signal, which will manage an array of strings. I'll get rid of that RxJS import. And I'll get rid of the all messages getter and instead set all messages to this messages as read only, as it was before. And here in add message, I'll simply update my messages signal with that update method where I get the old messages and where I then return a new array which copies all the old messages into it and adds the new message at the end. In the new message component, I also want to set enter text back to being a signal. And therefore, signal must be imported here, of course. And I'll therefore read the value down there where I need it, and I'll reset it by using the set method. And in the messages list component TypeScript file, I no longer register this property like this anymore. Instead, I just add messages and reach out to this messages service, all messages, so that I store a reference to that signal here. I can get rid of the async pipe import here and here. And in the template, instead of using that async pipe, I now simply read that messages signal again. And with that, this entire app uses signals. In all the places where I'm managing data that might change, I'm using signals. As a result, we can now get rid of Zone.js, and we do that in a two-step process. The first step is to go to the Angular JSON file, which configures this Angular project and how it's built. And there in the build node under polyfills, you want to make sure that this Zone.js polyfill is removed. And you'll need to stop your development server and restart it for that to have an effect. In addition, in the main.ts file, you should now go to Bootstrap application and add that configuration object to add providers. And it's now a special provider that should be imported from @Angular core. And the provider we need here is the provide experimental zoneless change detection. And this provider has this name for a reason. At the point of time where I'm recording this, it's experimental. It's not stable. It may contain bugs and it's likely to change. The name will also likely change. So if you're watching this, it might already be named Provide Zoneless Change Detection. At the moment, it still has that name. And in the end, this here is a function which you should execute here in your providers array. That will now disable Zone.js for this Angular application. So now Zone.js won't help Angular detect whether some timer expired or anything like that. Now it really comes down to signals telling Angular that something changed. And that's it. This also means that in the counter component, where I opt out of Zone.js for this second timer, we shouldn't do that anymore because we're not using Zone.js anymore anyways. So I don't opt out here and I no longer inject ngZone, which also means that the inject import and the ngZone import should be removed here. And with that, you hopefully should not get any error here, and the app should also still work as it did before. But now in this application here, you'll see the timer, once it expires, still does not trigger any change detection, even though I do not opt out of Zone.js anymore. But since we don't have Zone.js here in this app anymore, it's the same effect here. And if I change the counter, it's only the counter and the app component that's checked. And that happens for the same reason as before. The counter component is checked because a signal value changes in there. And then, just as before, change detection kind of bubbles up, at least still at the point of time where I'm recording this. So even though the app component does not use that signal, it's still checked for changes because one of its child components changed. But no other component was checked here, as you can tell. If I enter text here, you see it is in the end the app component and the messages and the new message component that is checked for every keystroke. But if I then save this, this appears just as before, even though I'm not using Zone.js anymore. So the app works the way it did before, and we still got quite some checking going on because change detection still checks parent components of components where something changed. But the entire change detection is now in the end driven by signals. Without Zone.js, if you were to manage that counter as a non-signal value, so as a regular property, which you reset like this, and which you update like this, for example, in both directions. If you do that, and in the template, you therefore don't read it as a value anymore because it's not a signal anymore. If you do all that and you switch back to this non-signal world, you'll see that if you reload and you change that counter, that still works. Because as I mentioned before, Angular, of course, handles those click listeners in the end, and therefore it is also able to listen to them, and it's able to trigger change detection when those clicks occur, because it can guess that maybe some data changed due to those events and that it should therefore check this component for changes. So that still works even when not using signals. But you'll notice that as you change that here, this counter is never reset. And keep in mind, I still have this timeout that does reset the counter. But this doesn't have any effect anymore because this is now an event that's not picked up by Angular. This is something that was previously handled by Zone.js, and now with Zone.js disabled, it's ignored. That's why we want to go back to that signal world here, and why I will revert all these changes and instead manage my count as a signal, because with that, we update the signal here, and therefore it doesn't matter why we update it or how that's triggered, it just matters that we update it, and therefore Angular will be notified about that. We also have to read the signal in the template again now, by the way. But Angular will be notified about that, and therefore now the timer will eventually reset here. It will reset once the timer expires, even without Zone.js, because I'm using signals here.